Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I am your host, Ozzie Ostwald. Federal, state, and local governments from time to time will monitor and surveil religious groups if they believe that beliefs might lead to actions that would be threatening. This raises important questions about religious belief and the potential for obstructing religious expression. My guest, Dr. Catherine Montalbano, has written a book, Government Surveillance of Religious Expression, Mormons, Quakers, and Muslims in the United States. This book examines the issues that are raised when government watches its citizens being religious. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much for having me.
And is it Katie, I think?
You feel free to call me Katie.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you joining us today. And since this is a program on religion and culture, I can't help but notice your ashes. So today's Ash Wednesday.
Today is Ash Wednesday, which marks the start of the Lent season. So I was able to get this into my schedule today before I came here.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, of course.
I know you're busy with classes and everything else.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, and we're happy to have you on campus. You're a relatively new faculty.
Yeah. So I moved here during the pandemic in the summer of 2020, and I've had a great experience thus far. I have wonderful students. It's a wonderful campus, and it's great to see activities like this and programs like this happening here.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that your time here has been during the pandemic because things have been a little unusual, but hopefully we'll get back to normal soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're in the Department of Communication,
Yes.
but one of your specialties, and I noticed your publications and your book, and even a class that you may teach here, deals with religion and media.
Correct.
In general. So coming from your side of the disciplinary fence, can you tell me what you see as some of the important issues that we need to be aware of when we're talking about, I guess, how media covers religion?
Yeah, so religion and media within the field of communication studies is its own kind of niche subfield, which is really, really versatile and wonderful. I tend to come from the more historical and sociological perspectives when I approach those issues. So what I see usually when I think about it is first and foremost those theoretical foundations of thinking about secularism and religiosity. So people like Talal Assad and Charles Taylor, people who are really kind of integral to those conversations, largely because the field of communication studies itself has an interesting relationship at the interface of what is considered secularism versus religion. Thinking particularly historically about the Telegraph, the way that historians wrote about the Telegraph as this religious experience. Right?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's
in my
interesting.
field, a scholar, right, James Carey, first wrote about this, and he made this really important case for the significance of taking religion seriously in the field of communication studies. So he was one of the first voices to be really adamant about that. And then I think moving forward in terms of more of the applied work, a lot of the really interesting work, of course, is, as you said, how does media cover religion? So that's something my colleague Greg Perot and I are working on in the Department of Communication. We just had one article come out in a journal called Journalism, looking at how, despite the decline of funding for religion reporting, a lot of religion reporters and mainstream news still see it as extremely important to public life. So how do they reconcile kind of the lack of funding, right, and space, since the religion beat is far and few between today compared to how it was, versus how they're able to cover it and kind of work with people both who are in secular papers as well as religious papers or other forms of media. And then the second half of that work is also looking at how we cover religion kind of in line with my book that aren't necessarily within the Christian hegemonic framework of US culture. So how do reporters, and what we found is, like, this is still under review, but in short, a lot of these newer, younger reporters, not necessarily younger, but just maybe on the fringe or kind of the margins of mainstream publications, are really looking into this, right? So people looking at like paganism or the Black church. How do we think about, or Muslim, communities in particular? How do we cover? Yeah.
Well, that raises an interesting question in and of itself, because
Sure.
American religious scholars know for some time now that the Protestant hegemony has been breaking down, and that religious diversity in America is increasing. Yet you don't see that kind of a reporting of the diversity of religions in America. But it sounds like that might be something that's gaining attention and might be changing, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, so definitely there are reporters who are concerned about this, and particularly those who themselves maybe come from other types of faiths that are not necessarily, within that umbrella of Protestant and or Catholic, depending on whether you consider Catholics part of that hegemonic framework umbrella. So yeah, there's definitely a push to start thinking more critically about how we cover all kinds of religions within U.S. culture and also, of course, globally. And then, yeah, I'm also looking at historically in a separate piece, broadcast coverage of religion, particularly right before the Iranian Revolution, because a lot of scholars, in my field anyway, have said that it wasn't really until the Iranian Revolution and Pope John Paul II that the news, broadly defined, started to take religion seriously. So I'm trying to push back against that narrative to look more closely at that 10-year period before to see how different religions are covered on the major big three networks.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So do media outlets typically have a religion editor or someone who is trained in religious studies who can kind of deal with the nuances of presenting religion in media?
That's a great question. So that's something that we focused on, my colleague and I, in our first article, or part of what we focused on is that's not necessarily always the case. So sometimes you have people who aren't necessarily trained in religious studies. And it's not to say that you need to necessarily have that theological training, but certainly some of our respondents would advocate greater understanding of those religions, not just from a journalistic perspective, but also from a theological and or historical or sociological perspective. So it's not always the case, unfortunately, given kind of the cut in funding of certain beats, that we always see someone who has that knowledge. So it's kind of a paradox, because on the one hand, they want to see these stories in some form, whether even if they can't have their own beat, right, in mainstream coverage. But on the other hand, is it worse if you're putting through these stories filtered through the politics beat or, education beat in ways that might dilute a greater understanding of the religious concerns of that community? So it's an ongoing struggle that reporters are concerned about, largely, again, because there's not always that structural support within the newsroom.
Right. And you mentioned theories of secularism. I think, kind of classical thinking from sociologists used to be that religion would eventually disappear as society becomes more secular, but I think we're rethinking that, right? I mean, religion's not going anywhere, so it's going to continue to be an important player in culture and society.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that a lot of these theorists that I've mentioned before, Jose Casanova as well, again, I'm largely coming from the sociology of religion side, so I'm probably missing people, but that is something that I think is remarkable and particularly distinctive about the United States. But also we can see elsewhere, for instance, in Brazil and other countries around the world, where this is also something to be taken seriously.
Well, let's talk about your book a little bit.
Sure.
Here it is. I read it. It's an excellent study. It's provocative. It's rich. And I think it has been received well by communication scholars as well as religious studies scholars. So you're kind of crossing disciplinary lines there. And I want to try to encapsulate maybe what I think the basic theme is, and then, of course, you're going to expand on that. But it seems to be an examination of this sort of tenuous balance between the American value of freedom of religious expression on the one hand, and the state concern for maintaining social order and safety on the other.
Right.
And I guess you're kind of weighing civil liberties versus public good, which happens all the time. But when it comes to religion, we run into some First Amendment issues that sort of complicate things. And so I think that's kind of at the heart of your examination. Is that a fair analysis? Yeah,
so I was initially intrigued by the third case study. I was living in New York for graduate school at the time, and that was based on a contemporary case study of Muslims in New York City who were being surveilled by the NYPD. And so a lot of my work tends to be inspired by contemporary concerns, societal ills, and then as a trained historian, particularly, I like to think backwards. So think, okay, what is the precedent for this? And of course, it's important not to be anachronistic, to apply contemporary understandings of things to previous periods.
Right.
So then I started to look into various case studies from different time periods, largely because I was interested in kind of these three governing principles. First, what was the role of what is considered insider or outsider in that particular time period? How did these monitoring officials, right? So I don't use the word surveillance in the earlier case studies because it was more of a contemporary word, so I say monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
How did they think about belief versus action, which was something that I found particularly striking in all three case studies. And how did they kind of justify, okay, how can we regulate or monitor action that is problematic or undermines state order or the public good versus this protected belief or expression.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, of course, the different political, economic environments and cultural environments that we're talking about here. We have late 19th century Mormons, mid 20th century Quakers, who were part of this activist group that the FBI struggled with understanding. Was this Quaker? Was this a political group? Somewhere in between. The Quakers are always causing trouble. And as someone who went to a Quaker college, I found out it's a very delightful group if you're into that sort of thing. And then, of course, how did they really kind of think about collecting information within these particular periods? And all of them, what was really interesting and I think is important as someone who does historical work was to go against this assumption that it's a binary, bad versus good story. There was actually some really interesting variation among these government agencies in terms of trying, even if they were not always successful, to really at least try and understand some of these religions, in particular the Quakers, to some degree the Mormons, and at least so the contemporary Muslims.
Yeah, and you mentioned not wanting to view these historical examples through contemporary lens, and I thought one of the things that you did really well in the book was to contextualize what was going on at the time, so that, and this is something I'd not really thought of in the terms of the Mormons. It's you're looking at polygamy and contextualizing it in terms of slavery and the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, so that part of the concern is that polygamy is a kind of a new form of slavery where women are trapped in some ways.
Yes.
And likewise with the Quakers, you're looking at a belief, pacifism, that, and the concern there was that it was somehow kind of counteracting efforts in the Cold War. And then, of course, with Muslims in a more contemporary setting with the War on Terror. So I thought that was a really important part of the book, to make sure that those three case studies were contextualized that way.
Yeah, and I think it really does show, sometimes with case studies it can be overwhelming because there are so many different groups that I could have talked about, but part of that kind of recurring theme is precisely this balance between state interests or what state interests were within that particular period and these very serious concerns. Slavery, Civil War, statehood for Utah, communism, right, and social order, and then of course the War on Terror, as you mentioned. So yeah, I think that was definitely kind of this overarching framework that I found really made them flow quite nicely within one another.
Yeah, as I was reading, and you don't mention this in your book, but one of the things that came to my mind was the Waco incident and tragedy, and Janet Reno's involvement with that, and the FBI's involvement. But so then I started thinking about all these examples where your case studies are so relevant.
Right.
And I guess that's part of what you want to accomplish with the book, is to use these case studies as a way of trying to navigate the interaction of government and religious bodies.
Absolutely, and as a communications scholar, there is like a group of us who are comm historians who believe that is the best way to really kind of understand our contemporary environment, whether it's talking about digital surveillance today or debates over media policy. Having this historical context allows you to kind of step back for a minute and think about, okay, what are the bigger takeaways here? Because sometimes it's very easy to get lost in the contemporary moment or concerns that you're a part of. So I always find that a very useful way of going about any of these big type of questions.
Yeah. So a moment ago you said that one of the things you wanted to examine was this idea that, or to look at how beliefs might produce certain actions, And then I think in your book you suggested that when government surveillance of Muslims was going on, that there was a kind of nuanced shift from how does belief influence actions to examining beliefs to try to predict actions.
Precisely.
Yeah. So is that something you see as a kind of contemporary shift with government surveillance, and does that raise any alarm bells to you? It kind of did for me.
Huge alarm, huge red flags. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's the elephant in the room is the intersection of race and religion, and ethnicity and religion as well. So I think what we see with the contemporary case study is a marked shift towards prediction and preemptive surveillance that is inherently predicated on assumptions, stereotypes, and that's what the NYPD report actually quite clearly, in my opinion, showed, was this reduction of this very diverse group of people into this kind of, four-pronged framework. So I think part of that is, again, difficulties with reconciling kind of these systemic, I would say almost racist underpinnings of what we might think about when we think of national security, right? Because with the previous two case studies, it's notable, and some historians will look at Mormons in a little bit of a different way, but being largely sort of either Protestant or Protestant adjacent and largely white, right, is a very different story. So I find it very concerning and troubling when we look at that very obvious shift towards preemptive and or predictive surveillance.
And you believe there is a racial component that kind of underlies that?
I think, yeah, subconsciously maybe, or consciously for sure.
And I guess also just a whole sense of otherness. I think that your book implies that I guess the more marginalized a religious movement is from that sort of Protestant center, I guess government agencies don't know quite what to do with the other in religion, or the greater sense of otherness, and that raises red flags too. That anything that seems, I guess, outside of the mainstream automatically gets more attention. You think? Is that?
I think so, and I think it's also kind of tying back to our earlier conversation about religion reporting. Not the same thing by any means in terms of maliciousness or unintentional maliciousness, but there is this sense of how do we make sense of religion that is not Christian or Protestant. Talal Asad talks about this, right? Even within the history of religious studies, the need to push to better understand terminology, or to understand Islam or Judaism or other religions that are not within this umbrella that we're comfortable with through their own terms, right? And not somewhat like anachronism, right? Not applying Christian understandings of what is religion onto other kinds of religion, right? Redeveloping a new terminology, and I think we see that with surveillance as well.
Yeah, one of the quotations that you used in your book really caught my eye, which is relevant here, and I think it was President Grant who was talking about the Mormons, and was talking about the need to stop polygamy because it was going to undermine traditional moral values, and he referenced the U.S. being a Christian nation, right? And that was the problem he had with polygamy, that it was outside the boundaries of what he would consider traditional Christian values.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, the whole notion of secularism, depending on which theorist you look at, right, is that secularism isn't a break, right, from religion. It's an evolution, so it's constantly like a dialectic where we're moving from one point to another, and then it's kind of appropriating elements of religion into the new form. So even that conversation, or that quote from Grant, shows this kind of way in which conceptions or constructions of what is the secular state, or in the interest of the secular state, is still somehow tied to this religious core.
Yeah. And I guess one of the problematics here that you talk about in your book is not only defining the difference between sacred and secular, or religious and non-religious, but trying to define the dividing line between legitimate and illegitimate practices, or deviant practices even. And that's a problem because, again, this sort of Protestant Catholic moral center I guess, is still in place to some extent, even though the landscape is much more diverse.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, people will somewhat disagree, are Catholics kind of within that core center or not, but either way, I mean, I think you can still agree that this Christian center is that guiding compass when it comes to covering religion or understanding religion or deciding what is considered permissible or not.
This is a question you don't deal with in the book, but I wonder if, to the extent that what we're talking about is balancing civil liberties against public good, are there any lessons COVID lessons that can be learned from this? Because I know a lot of people refuse vaccines for religious reasons or for reasons of personal liberty, and again, balancing that against the public good of trying to get people vaccinated or to achieve herd immunity. Are these kind of relevant issues as well?
I mean, certainly we could think of it in that way. I think that, again, it might depend on the degree to which you see the intersection of your religion with your political values, but again, does that necessarily need to be the way we think about it? I think we can step back from religious differences or political differences and think about it in precisely those terms that you framed it. What is the collective good, right, versus individual will, and when does one trump the other? So I do think that certainly we can think about some of the sacrifices that some of these religious groups might have made to be able to kind of, for example, with the Mormons, okay, we understand, right, that in order for us to be admitted, right, into statehood, there are certain things that we need to accept, right, classic social contract theory. I think that might be a good way, particularly looking at it historically, to kind of depoliticize the very contentious conversations that people have today about this debate, and think about it in a maybe more objective and distanced way to help make those decisions. Yeah.
So I want to ask you a question about the Quakers, because you focused on one specific group.
Yeah, the AFSC, American Friends Service Committee, based in the FBI office that they broke into is in Media, Pennsylvania, where I lived for my first 2 years as an assistant professor there. And the Quakers are close to my heart, having graduated from Haverford College, which is a Quaker college outside of Philadelphia. So that is where I first engaged with the Quakers, and I was really struck by some of the similarities, although perhaps even they're maybe more aggressive in terms of their commitment to social justice, like the social justice component of the Catholic Church as well. So coming from that background, I was super intrigued by the parallels, but also differences in how Quakers operated in this sphere.
So you mentioned like social justice advocates within the Catholic Church, maybe liberation theology, the belief structure of pacifism in the Quakers. Are these things that set off alarm bells with government agencies because they're associated with communism or left-wing groups? Is that what's going on here?
Yeah. Well, there were multiple issues that the Quakers did. There were multiple issues that they took up, so they kind of took them all up. Certainly the plight of refugees, obviously concerns about reaching out to communist circles in ways that, again, circumvented these binaries of, good versus bad. Women's issues, really everything across the board that you would, or we might consider progressive today. And I think what concerned the FBI in particular was, okay, they're a very active group, right? Thinking again about that distinction between belief or action. They're out there doing these things. Is this something that we need to monitor? Because it's not just literally, but also figuratively out there, right? And so the Quakers really pretty much every issue you can imagine, but certainly the communism component was the major red flag, right? But then there were the other issues that were of concern, but it's important to know, even Hoover had some of his reservations about this. He wasn't sure, and some of the FBI offices, they conducted the surveillance as they were ordered, and they defended them. They said, they're doing good work. This is, acceptable within, the framework of what we would consider okay. So it's a really fascinating case study that shows the variation even among the FBI.
Oh. So just what do you think your impact will be with this book? Do you see this as a kind of a plea to government agencies for greater understanding, or will there be guidance going forward as these obviously cases will continue to arise?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So where do you see this book fitting into the literature or into the guidance going forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great work in surveillance studies that is conducted, but I see this book in particular as really bridging what I saw as a gap area with explicitly, between surveillance and religion. And now there, of course, is other work on those two fields looking at the intersection. But I hope that, the way this book was written and the way I kind of framed the concerns, although I did my best to remain kind of objective as a historian is want to do in their writing, I do think it's pretty obvious that I am advocating a greater concern for religious expression to prevent at least this preemptive or predicting type of model that we see with the last case study, in the hopes that although there may be legitimate concerns moving forward about certain groups, whether it's because of what they do or what they believe, that there is more of a methodical way of going about, right, conducting that sort of monitoring or surveillance that doesn't encroach upon or kind of go beyond what might be a problematic barrier, right, between state interest and, of course, this very sacred belief that we have in this right to express ourselves in and through our religious cultures.
The free expression clause of the First Amendment.
Precisely.
Yeah, and it's, in the end, right, the surveillance of these three groups did have some impact on the free exercise of these groups' religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Mormons eventually renounced polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
The particular Friends group that you mentioned actually became more politicized, which is an interesting reaction in and of itself. And then certain Muslim leaders who were under the microscope would have limited their kind of public affiliation with Islam. So there was some fallout and some, I guess, impact upon religious expression in these three cases.
Yes.
And I would imagine in most cases that we would look at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great way of characterizing it. And I think with the contemporary issue with Muslim Americans or Muslims who are living in the United States, there is this really significant problem that is not yet addressed, right? Which is, how do we rebuild trust? I mean, there's a lot of lack of trust for very good reasons, right? With people who are not practicing the faith wanting to come in, even if it's within the reporting context, right? And so even like the issue of only trusting other Muslim reporters to speak to you about these issues as well. So I think we see the repercussions of that problem, right? Not just in religious expression, but in public life for people who identify as Muslim here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in the couple minutes we have left, I'm interested to hear about your future work, and
Yeah.
I know you have a couple of works out there now being considered, and you're continuing your research. Where do you see your interest in religion and media taking you?
Yeah, so the second half of that piece with my colleague is under review, really looking again at how religion reporters considered the coverage of groups that were, again, not within this Christian mainstream norm. And then the other article is focusing more on broadcast journalism, which raises different concerns. Journalism is journalism, but of course there's the visual and audio component when we think about network coverage. So really trying to historicize and kind of challenge the historical narrative thus far that coverage of Muslims and coverage of particular groups really did not emerge until a certain period. So those are the two main works in religion and media that I'm working on. And then, of course, I also have the communication law component of my work as well. So I'm similar to this book, historicizing the contemporary debates over what's called Section 230, which is basically an internet policy that governs or protects ISPs and social media platforms from liability. And there is some, certainly I could argue maybe some concern about religious expression there as well.
Right.
Right.
Well, I can't wait to see what you produce in the years to come. Thank you so much. And
thank you so much.
thank you for joining me today. I really
Absolutely.
appreciate you giving your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's
Yeah.
been wonderful having this conversation.
Great. Well, that's it for Religion and Life this week, and I hope you'll join us again on App TV next time when I interview Dr. Bill Leonard about his book on Appalachian religious traditions. Until then, this is Ozzy Oswald.
Nothing is yours.